Hello everyone, good evening. My name's Amy. I work over in the supplement side at Nature's Way, and tonight we are going to be talking about sprouted foods and microgreens and the health benefits that you can all get from doing that. If anybody has any cell phones or anything, just make sure you turn the volume off or the ringer. If you need to take a phone call, you can go out here. We will be discussing the health benefits with Ian Giesbrecht, and any purchases that you guys want to make afterwards, any of the stuff that we have in the store, we do carry a lot of the seeds, the jars, the sprouting bags. There's a lot of us that do that in the store ourselves, so we can help inform you on how to get started. And we'll be offering a 20% discount at the tonight only after the class is over. And I would be able to help you with that over here. So you can take it over.
I would just like to start by thanking you all for coming and joining us. What we're going to do for the next 45 minutes or so is go over some of the whys, the hows of sprouting, explaining some of the benefits, explaining some of the context, and of course, how to do that yourself. So just a quick show of hands, who's sprouted anything? That's awesome. Who's currently, at this moment, sprouting something? Wonderful. That's great news. Even better news is that any child can do it, and anyone can do it with a few moments of time. You don't need a garden. You don't need access to a high tunnel. Really, this is about, and I've done this backpacking as well as bike touring. This amount of space is really all you need. So it's very simple, very empowering, and we're going to go through a bit of the overview, a little historical context. We're going to talk about the basics of what is sprouting, the types of sprouts, of course, how to sprout, and how to use those sprouts when you have them. So the basics of it, let me just get... The basics of what we're doing with sprouting is, I consider it a part of a holistic health and wellness strategy. And that strategy is geared towards resiliency, towards adaptation, and sustainable is a word you might want to use, but ultimately it's empowered, because by sprouting and by providing sprouted foods for myself, for my family, for my community, we're allying with a much bigger life force than ourselves. We think we're in control as humans, but really we are just guiders or manipulators or tenders. So part of what it is it's connecting with life cycles. And there's the ebbs, the flows, the seasonal things. And what I really like about sprouting is you can connect the life cycle within 5 days, even within 2 days for something like lentils. But what you're doing is essentially shifting that life force. You're giving it life opportunity by giving it water, and then it sprouts and grows, and that nutrition is good for us, obviously. But that connection to that cycle I find is really important and grounding. For me, it's a part of returning to source. So we think of food, we think of all the ways that we can eat, but you break it down, and most of the American diet is based on a few grains and a very few vegetables and a very few animals. Where do those come from? What context are we eating those foods in? So if we think about a hot dog and what goes into that, a very American thing, we think about the grain that grew the bun. And you go back far enough and you realize that at some point that grain was taking sunlight in. That grain was sprouting and germinating. So I see sprouting as also a way to return to source. What it's doing is essentially unlocking the power of that seed. Now, seeds are obviously very dense nutrition. They're not always very accessible. They're good for storage. It's said that stored grains is one of the main things that allowed humans to civilize, whatever that means to any of us, but increase population, become sedentary, because we could take those, store those, and have those later on. Many examples around the world, from rice to wheat to corn. Potatoes are not quite a grain, but they offered the same thing. And it allowed humans to kind of take the pressure off from hunting and gathering and moving and sedentary. And that's no judgment of whether that's a positive or negative thing, but that's kind of where we've gone, and that's one of the big things. Another great thing about sprouting is it helps transform and increase. When a seed is dormant, it's obviously very storable, but it's also very veiled in a kind of dormancy that you might not have access to. So through the sprouting process, what we're doing is essentially changing that form And we're increasing some of the positive benefits, and we're decreasing some of the negative benefits. And we'll go into that a little more in further sections. But basically, I want to highlight some of the overarching themes about what sprouting can do and how it relates to your life. So it's about connecting with life cycles, it's about returning to source, it's about unlocking the power of seeds, and it's about transforming and increasing. And so all of that can be folded into your lifestyle, whether you're growing sprouts for yourself, whether you're growing sprouts for your animals, whether you're growing sprouts, well, for your friends or anyone else. But basically, it's a great, I don't want to call it a hobby, but it's something I really like because it keeps me motivated, it keeps me in a process and cycles. So that's kind of the overview of what sprouting is. From here, we'll jump a little bit into the historical context of sprouting. Now, any ideas what role it might have played in cultures of the past? Anyone have any ideas of how it might fold into our ancestors or ancestors of other places? Anything come to mind? What's the first thing when I say sprouts? What do you get? What food or what dish do you guys think of? Sourdough. Plants. Any specific species or varieties of sprouts that are the most common? When I say sprouts, what's the food you all think of? Alfalfa. Yep. Bean sprouts. Broccoli. So all of those, especially bean sprouts, when we're talking about mung beans, kind of broccoli sprouts I think are fairly more modern invention or realization. But when we talk about mung bean sprouts, they actually play a very important role. So we're going to go back a few thousand years and imagine the world as a much smaller place. And the way that we explored that was by sea vessels. Now there's a problem with sea vessels in that the nutrition we need has to be stored. And that nutrition sometimes is in the form of vitamins. And those vitamins are living things that don't store so well over long periods of time. So here's what gets a little interesting, is the Chinese had developed a way of sprouting mung beans, which are very common food in that part of the world. And by doing so, they were able to take these seeds, travel with them, and by sprouting them, they were actually increasing and having live vitamin C. So obviously, we've all heard of scurvy and associated vitamin C and other mineral and vitamin deficiencies. And this was a really important advantage because this meant that voyages could go out for months on end with stored seeds which could theoretically store for several years if stored correctly. And with simply water, no sunlight needed, and a little bit of water, fresh water, those seeds could be transformed into essentially a living multivitamin. So the Chinese have been doing this thousands of years ago. Captain Cook was another very famous explorer who actually made vitamin tablets with sprouted grains and seeds. So because of those disadvantages of long-term voyages, imagine sailors, you're loopy enough on the sea for several months, you're losing your teeth, you're going literally crazy because you don't have vitamin C. Limes and lemons were touted as one of the things that he used, but also sprouted cakes or pills in a sense. So this goes back quite a ways, and it was necessary. Now we're not on a sea voyage. We can go forage chickweed at this time of year, or dandelion, or lamb's quarters are starting to come up, or grow a garden, or any number of things. So we don't essentially need that. But what we can do is remember that this is a part of our ancestral history. This is a part of our wisdom in our bodies. Human, plant. And that relationship is really fascinating and useful because we can ally with those plants and actually get a great deal of nutrition we need simply by understanding a few simple facts of what that plant is doing. One example I want to bring up that's not quite sprouting, but that shows the importance and power of having to connect humans to plants and a proper cultural context. And this is something that comes from fairly south of here in what we know as Mexico or Guatemala, where corn originated. And that relationship's fascinating, and I won't go into it very detailed, but otherwise, eating corn raw or boiled even actually lacks nutrients, even if it's combined with beans and such, and it creates nutrient deficiencies. The people figured out how to, it's called nixtamalization. You boil limestone with corn, and it unlocks lysine and makes it much more digestible, making it a nutritious food. That shows you the importance of cultural context and knowing the plant. Somehow, I don't know how it's figured out, but it happened. The same thing with sprouting. A lot of the today's modern diet doesn't remember that ancestral wisdom. It doesn't go back far enough to place us as biological beings in the biological world. So sprouting is a really great way to reintegrate, remind, and ground the fact that we're biological beings and our food should be biological too. Organic has a lot of connotations to it, but if you even go before that and say, I'm eating biologic food, this food is alive, this food is biogenic or bioavailable, meaning its life force has the potential to affect our life source in a very real way. So moving into the future, more modern times, we see that in about 1870, the enzyme as a thing was named and understood. So this is fairly recent in history. Until then, we knew there was gardening, obviously, and we had mastered a lot of techniques, but the enzyme, the force, some call it the worker bee. Anne Wigmore was a woman, and she revolutionized a lot of living foods and sprouted foods in the 60s and 70s, and she called the enzymes the worker bees, the ones that do the work. They are responsible in our bodies for blinking, digesting. Most of our body functions have an enzyme, if you think of them as a catalyst, as a mover, as a motivation. So these enzymes were first understood in 1870. Now I say this all because sprouts have a great deal of enzymes, among other things. That came with a book it took about 31 years of research. And this is one of the main books called Enzyme Nutrition. I found this at a secondhand store, luckily. And it goes into all the ways in which enzymes affect our life, affect our aging, our regeneration or degeneration. And all of that is to say that these sprouts that we're growing and eating, or could be or are, have incredible amounts of enzymes. So Anne Wigmore was a protege of Edward Howell, who wrote this book. And he wrote the book in 85, but started in 1932. So you can imagine, fast forward to today, how many people have been interested, how many people have progressed, the culture, the recipes, the technologies. And of course, there's a more modern raw food movement, which I was really hot on for a while. I had a great experiment in my life for about 8.5 years. I was a vegan, and I learned a lot about plants, about gardening, and about connecting with, like I said earlier, getting back to the source of things. What is my food? Where does it come from? What form it's in? And I learned a great deal about the importance of enzymes and vitamins. Now I don't eat raw food and I'm no longer vegan. I currently homestead with my partner and we grow a lot of perennial crops, and the sprouting and the raw food still has a great impact in terms of my awareness and overall context, but there's been a lot of work that has been done to research and investigate some of the benefits. So that's kind of the older history to newer history, and we're going to just overview a little bit about what sprouting can offer before we dive into the concept of sprouts, before we get into how to sprout. So hang with me. And for those of you who are going to stick to the end, we have a few samples of some things that I've sprouted and such. I will say I'm sorry I've been on vacation for the past couple weeks. Otherwise, I would probably have trays and trays and trays of things, but I just got back 2 days ago. So sprouting, a little bit about what it can do, about what it can offer. To start off with, one of the things I really like is it's a locally empowering, high vitality food. Now, when we think of high vitality, we think of life source. We often think of young, and that doesn't necessarily mean in age, but that vibrancy. And if you think of a sprout as the very first phase of life, it's just waking up, it's just going, it hasn't had the issues that older plants get if you see an older plant attacked by aphids, or we've all seen those apple trees that are old and decrepit and been there for 80 years and kind of on their last legs. So it offers an empowerment, and that is such a way that I can take some seeds, I can harvest those seeds, or I can purchase those seeds for a small amount of money and turn those seeds into living food. That term again is biogenic or bioactive, meaning we can actually access and use those foods. Another thing that it's important about sprouts is it can help cellular regeneration. Now, there's a lot in there, and there's a lot of details to that, which we'll get into a little later. But if you think of your body as a living organism, inputting those things that are actively alive, actively growing, actively shifting, in such a way that supports our cells and supports our DNA. And that's really important in an age when we have pollution, when we have aging, oxidative stress. Living on this earth damages us in certain ways. So the more that we can input the things that support our regeneration, the healthier we'll be. Sprouting offers a host of phytochemicals and vitamins to nourish and protect the body. So like I said before, the vitamins are living. We need them to be alive. They're heat sensitive. So if you have a beautiful vegetable that you grew or you traded or you bought or you found or you foraged or what have you, cooking that is often a very common way and a very useful way for many vegetables. But the vitamins in there are very heat sensitive, so when you cook something, those vitamins are either destroyed or reduced. So those vitamins can help support our body. They can act as antioxidants. They can again help cellular regeneration. And a phytochemical is simply a chemical from a plant, phyto being plant. So there's plants in their infinite wisdom have a host of chemicals, either for their benefit or ours, I don't know, whether it's a medicine to, a healthy plant should have this, an immune system to repel pests. It will have a protective thing against sunlight or whatnot. So these phytochemicals support our body. On that, it's a good way to boost immunity. So because of all the different benefits that we get from vitamins and enzymes and accessible minerals, that living food helps support our body, which in turn supports our immune system. Healthy body, healthy immune system. Pretty straightforward, and that should be a positive feedback loop. The healthier you are, the healthier your immune system are, the healthier you stay. You don't get bogged down, and there's no need to kind of go down that rabbit hole of, I have an illness, get a pharmaceutical medicine that's not really supporting holistic health. So sprouts are a good way for that. Of course, the high quality nourishment and nutrition. And significantly, there's two things here, in that digestible protein and healthful fats. So we often, especially today when fats are kind of coming back in as a fad food, for a while there was the fats are bad and saturated fats are bad, and I won't get into all of that, but fats are important, especially fat-soluble vitamins, and these are things that we need. We need the fat, and there's a lot of research now saying, oh, actually, fats really are good for your brain, and fats have a lot of health-promoting benefits. So in sprouted foods, especially nuts and seeds, the fat content is alive. So because that seed is either in the process of sprouting or dormant, it really depends on how accessible it is. And the proteins, of course, are more accessible and digestible. It's not about how many grams of protein you eat, it's how many you're assimilating. Another great benefit is it helps alkalize the body. So anyone know the baseline of what a healthy, normal body should be? The blood pH? 7. I think it's around, I'm not exactly sure, it's 7.0. So it's around neutral. We have 0 to 14. Interestingly enough, most disease organisms or pathogens don't survive at a higher pH. It's pretty simple. There's a lot of research. There's a Nobel Prize awarded to a scientist, the name escapes me, who figured out that cancer actually doesn't survive in an alkaline body. Wow, imagine that. So sprouts are one of the ways, along with deep breathing, exercise, meditation, cold water immersion, many techniques to help raise the body's pH. So by doing so, you're actually decreasing the comfort levels of these disease-causing organisms. So we're actually promoting a better biome, you could call it. They're also a source of chlorophyll. Now, we all know chlorophyll. You look outside anywhere and it's green. It's essentially the world's largest collection of solar panels, plants. You think of it that way. They're able to take solar energy, transfer that to sugar, to energy. And one little interesting note is that the molecules of hemoglobin, red blood cells, and plant chlorophyll is one molecule difference. If you were to switch the magnesium in chlorophyll for an iron in hemoglobin, you'd actually have the same molecule. So it's very close to us, and it's a very good source of that. We'll talk a little bit more about chlorophyll later. They're also a very economical and accessible food. Not if you buy them from Whole Foods, though. They're very expensive at times. Certain issues around freshness or around labor is definitely one of them, around shelf life. And I think it's great that they're in stores, but I would actually like to see more and more, hopefully everyone here, increase their ability to sprout. We used to sell sprouts to restaurants, and it was great because I would grow a lot of sprouts. It's very easy, high turnover, and I would sell them to a restaurant, and it was a great income for us. That said, moving forward, I think it would be great if everyone was growing their own sprouts because it reduces the need for shipping in and refrigeration and all those things. Okay, so now what are sprouts? We talked a lot about, we're going to go back a little bit, not to the history, but to kind of what's happening. What's actually happening when you have, so here's an example. Now these are lentils that 2 nights ago I soaked in water. And that's all that happened. You can see some tails coming out. In a couple days, they'd be very long. They won't get that long. We'll eat them before then. So what's actually happening? The seed of most plants, now not all plants are good for sprouting, but assume this seed is an edible seed and it's good for sprouting. What's actually happening is it's the first stage of life. So this is a seed, okay? And inside of it, it has all the intelligence, nutrition, resources it needs, minus water, basically, to create a new plant. Some nutrition will be needed as it grows, but basically this is a self-contained unit. It's a true miracle that this happens all the time. It's happening right outside, right now. So when you soak it, it opens. What's happening there is it has 2 things, 3 things actually, I'll briefly mention. It has a radicle, so it has the root already there. It has a plumule, which is the shoot, the young shoot, and it has cotyledons, which are 2 baby leaves. So that's basically what is happening. When you soak it, it opens up, it starts to transform. So what's happening there? Well, again, it's becoming biogenic, it's becoming bioactive, it's moving. So some significant things here are the enzyme content. And those enzymes are increasing, those enzymes are waking up. When we eat enzymes, this is the important part about enzymes. Our bodies can produce enzymes. The more that we produce, the more stress it puts on our body. So by eating foods with high enzyme content like sprouts, we're actually reducing the load that our body needs to carry. Theory that Edward Howell had, now I'm saying a theory because it's not necessarily proven over long periods of time, it does make sense though, is that the more enzyme-rich foods we eat, the less our bodies have to produce enzymes, and the longer we will live, and the longer we will live without degeneration. So it's a tax on the body. So those enzymes also help with digestion. There's sometimes capsulated enzymes for people with poor digestion, often extracted from papayas, I believe, but you could just get those from sprouts. Especially if you were having trouble digesting protein, you would have a high protein food because protease would be an enzyme produced. Or if you're having an issue digesting fatty foods, you could soak fattier nuts and they would have lipase, which is an enzyme which helps digest fats. So the other thing that's happening is the vitamins are increasing. Now this is very significant because in this example of lentils, a dry lentil compared to a sprouted lentil has 600% more vitamin C. Now where did that vitamin C come from? It's a very strange thing to be able to increase your food value. But it's stored, and through a complex series of interactions, that vitamin C is actually being created and alive. So that life force is actually increasing. So 600% increase in vitamin C in lentils. That's huge. And like I said earlier, they're living organisms. So vitamins are not so much what they are, but what they do. So they're classified by their actions. And their actions are only relevant if they're alive and not cooked. In mung beans, here I'll throw some numbers at you. At 285% increase in vitamin B1, 515% in B2, and 256% in B3. Now those numbers are from Isabel Shippard, and she was an herbalist and a proponent of sprouts who did a lot of biochemical research into the nutrition of sprouts, and she came up with some quite astounding numbers of how much more increase it gets in nutrition. Another important part about sprouts is the minerals. Now minerals are, of course, very stable molecules, but they're not always very accessible. So when a seed is sprouted, chelation happens, which is the binding of that protein to another substance. You can eat those minerals, and unless they're chelated or accessible, you're not going to benefit from them. In a world where we have many mineral deficiencies, in fact, most Americans, it's something like 80 or 85% of us are magnesium deficient, among others. Wide range of narrowing of genetics of the diet, as well as poor soil health. But the bottom line is we can all use more minerals, and sprouting helps chelate and make those minerals more accessible. So this is all happening when you're sprouting. We talked a little bit about phytochemicals, antioxidants, which help protect and regenerate. One I'll mention here, there's broccoli sprouts mentioned at the start. Now, broccoli sprouts have received a little bit of press, and Joseph Mercola did some research through the Johns Hopkins University and found out that, wow, sulforaphane, which is commonly found also in watercress, which is another great source of it, which doesn't require planting. We harvest it all year long at certain springs, especially underwater. And sulforaphane has the highest concentrations in broccoli sprouts. There's sulforaphane, the sulfur component to a lot of brassicaceae or cruciferous vegetables, so kale, kohlrabi, cabbage, etc. They all have it, but broccoli sprouts have the highest concentration of it. And sulforaphane has an incredible potential to, he describes it as allowing our cells to wake up. It's called methylation. And supposedly, it helps your cells take out the trash. It helps the detox pathways open up. That's really important. We're all inundated with toxins, whether it's from our food, our environment. Just being alive today, we interact with them. So it helps do that, which is a really good open detox pathway. But it is incredibly good also at preventing cancer. So it's an anti-carcinogen. And that's a really important part. Now, broccoli sprouts are not the only ones that have sprouts that have sulforaphane, but they are just the highest concentrations. So the last thing about what's happening when it's sprouting I want to mention is anti-nutrients. Now, an anti-nutrient is a very simple thing. It's something that stops nutrition. And the reason it's there, I'll explain a little bit. Go back to that seed, it's stored, it's ready to grow, or it's almost ready to grow. It doesn't have water yet, but it's stored for next year. And that seed is essentially collecting all of that energy, and it is harnessing it for future generations. So before that happens, what it wants to do is stay alive. That's its objective, as far as I can tell. I don't know what the plant is thinking, but I can imagine that's its main objective. So it contains within it certain things that stop other things from eating it, and it stops it from prematurely germinating. If the conditions aren't right, premature germination could kill the plant. So what does that mean for us? Certain things like phytic acid is a very common one. What it does is it stops herbivores from eating it, or it might stop germination. What it does in our bodies, though, is very disastrous. I don't want to scare anyone. It's in most processed foods. It's in grains, nuts, seeds, beans. And it's one of those things that kind of slips under the radar. We don't hear much about it in nutrition classes. But the anti-nutrient that phytic acid is, it's a nutrient uptake inhibitor. So it blocks your ability to absorb minerals. And it actually takes minerals from your body. That's really significant because what that does to a body is it not only nourishes, but it steals from us. Just like white sugar will, it will steal from our body. And there was a very fascinating dentist. Has anyone heard of Weston A. Price? Yes. So he did some really great research looking at indigenous diets and traditional foods. And one of the things he came up with, among many others, was that phytic acid is something that causes dental caries. It causes cavities. So it makes us weaker. Now, it's in any processed food because we don't ally with that ancestral wisdom that we have. We don't sprout our grains. We don't ferment our grains, generally speaking. And so the simplest way you can have that information and do something about it is to soak. You don't even need to sprout. Even just soaking your grains before you cook them can get rid of them. Rice is a good example. There are certain kinds of rice that you can sprout, but many of them don't sprout very well. But if you soak, it does the same thing. Soaking brown rice for 24 hours, for instance, leaches some of that phytic acid, and you'll know there's that color. Next time you get some almonds or nuts, soak some nuts for 8 to 12 hours, and you'll see that water is it's often very unpleasant looking. I don't really want to drink it. It's kind of rusty colored. And part of that is those anti-nutrients. So are there any questions so far?
I have a question.
Yeah.
When the phytic acid is leached out,
Mhm.
it's still there in the water, so you don't want to drink the water.
Exactly, yeah. So if you look at that water, you ask yourself, do I want to drink that? And I've tried with clover sprouts just to see, what does it taste like? It's not very tasty, but it's essentially not what you want also. So yeah, you wash it out, and anything that might be residual in the seed is actually neutralized. So it's a really good way to do that. It's a good question. Any others?
Is that why they say to soak beans before you cook them?
That's definitely one reason.
Boil them for an hour and then let them set and drain the water?
I couldn't tell you the scope of that. That will help, and it will drain the phytic acid. I don't know if that's the that's the reasoning. It certainly helps soften and it helps make more digestible. But however you do it, if you soak beans even before you cook them, it will take that phytic acid out and it will make them more digestible.
Do all the nuts, because you mentioned almonds,
Mhm.
and I've heard of you're supposed to soak almonds. I haven't, I will now. And you said for 24 hours, just regular?
8 to 12 usually for nuts.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's a chart if anyone's interested. All of these details and more are in this book that I wrote about sprouts.
Okay.
So everything I'm talking about, there's also recipes and charts. But if you look online, either I can give you a link or find your own, and there's charts for how long. The general concept is the bigger the seed, the longer the soak.
And you soak all your nuts, like walnuts and
Yep.
everything?
Yep.
Okay.
And you'll notice the flavor profile changes. A lot of almonds and nuts in general, they'll oxidize and become kind of stale, if not rancid. Now, if you can get good nuts, that doesn't happen. But you'll notice that the flavor becomes fresher and crisper in a way. And you will notice that color in the water as well.
You mentioned crisper. The flavor's crisper, but I have trouble with my nuts getting kind of chewy. Can you stick them in the dehydrator without?
That's a great idea. And I've done that. I don't have that fancy kitchen right now, but that's a really good way. Sometimes my favorite is teriyaki almonds, and I put some shoyu and some honey. I can't recall. The recipe's in there, but my partner Wren loves them. Yeah. So I soak them, I dress them a little bit up, just gently. And the dehydrating, I'm telling you, think about a toasted nut versus a dehydrated or sprouted and dehydrated nut, and there's really no comparison in taste.
I'm not killing too many nutrients, but
No.
just
Especially if you use an actual dehydrator.
Yeah,
For those who don't have a dehydrator, I find just leaving your door open in the oven, it's just the light and it's about 100 degrees. If I'm not mistaken, it's 115 or 116 that enzymes start being destroyed. So if you can keep it below that, you'll keep your enzyme content up.
And sprouted almonds are fantastic.
Yeah.
You can buy them, they're twice as expensive as regular ones, but the regular ones are really chewy. The sprouted ones are crisp and they've got like a little bit of a salty taste to them.
Yeah, they're really good.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said you soak your walnuts?
Yeah.
So how long do you leave them soak?
So about 8 to 12 hours. General rule for most nuts, except for cashews, 8 to 12. And just water. Sally Fallon suggests salt, and you could do that. I don't really know what the difference is, but depending on your use.
So after 8 to 12 hours, and you eat them?
Yeah, I would drain and rinse, and we'll get into that about sprouting in a moment. But yeah, you could eat them, or like she was saying, you could dehydrate them, you could puree them, you could do all sorts of things with them. You could throw them and juggle them, I mean, whatever. It's totally up to you. All right, we'll move forward. Okay.
how long are the cashews? You said
Okay, so the cashews are 1 to 4 hours, and cashew's kind of an interesting, has anyone seen a cashew fruit, by the way? So yeah, they're very weird. They're like an upside down, or no, it'd be like a pear shape, fat on the bottom, and then it has a large seed on the bottom of that. And it's kind of unique, but the basics of it is that cashews will start leaching some of their fat. They're so soft that after 4 hours, they'll lose some of their fat, and that fat will go in the water, and you don't want that because that fat's really good for you. So that's the only exception that I know of right now. Okay, so we're going to get a little bit of overview of what kind of sprouts and that aspect of returning to source and kind of classifying where these foods come in before we get into how we're going to sprout. So backing up, what is food and where does it come from and how do we ally with that? And if you really break it down, I like botany. I love plants. I spend the rest of my life learning about plants, and I probably will. Sprouting is a good intro, and it in fact was my first kind of gateway. I call it my gateway drug into food foresting and permaculture because it's really easy, it's accessible, you can do it over and over. People generally are willing to try something that tastes good and looks different, generally. So it's a really good intro, and what it taught me was to start looking at classifications. So very simply, I can break it down into about 4 categories of sprouts. First one we're going to talk about is nuts and seeds, like we've talked about. Now, nuts actually grow on trees. Duh. Peanuts are not technically a nut, but most tree nuts can be soaked or sprouted. One word is that they won't grow like most other sprouts where you'll see a tail come out that's that radical or that plumule. Because they've been taken out of their context, the shell has been taken off, they won't actually, sometimes they will, but they won't often grow the way another seed would, like a broccoli seed or an alfalfa seed where it's contained, that shell, that hull is still intact. So they'll swell. We call it sprouting. Really, it's more like soaking. It has the same benefits, it has the same process. It's just not actually going to keep growing. So the sprouting time is shorter. And seeds like sunflower, like pumpkin, chia and flax are a little bit different. I'm sure we all know they're kind of mucilaginous, slimy. So they don't sprout like any other seeds. You can grow them as microgreens. And we're going to talk a little about the difference in a sec. But the first one would be nuts and seeds. We ate a coconut sprout. We were visiting her folks in Florida. And if anyone's had a coconut sprout, it is one of the most delightful treats ever. It's not like anything else. The seed itself starts to sprout, and of course a coconut's a very large seed, and it transfers that energy, just like another sprout, into the young, rich sweetness. So it takes that fat and turns it into, it's called in Spanish it would translate as a coconut apple. And it's this cloud-like, fluffy, sweet thing. So if you have the chance, you can even eat a coconut sprout. But the point is, all sprouts and all seeds and nuts can be sprouted. So that's one category, lots of fat. You can do a lot with that. You can do milks, dairy-free milks. You can do yogurts. You can do kind of cheeses. You can do pâtés, which I have one to share afterwards. You can do granola. I mean, as far as you're creative, you can use them. Lots of fat, like I said, and lots of protein also, less on the starch. Legumes. So we all know legumes, they're great. They have a great biological function of fixing nitrogen in a biological sense in a garden. But we think of alfalfa, clover, peas, beans. A lot of these can be grown as what we typically think of as sprouts, alfalfa or clover sprouts. But they can also be grown as microgreens, as shoots. The one word of caution I will say is that there's some studies that cannavanine, which is a compound in alfalfa, might have some implications with MS, I believe, and other system functions. But clover sprouts don't have that. So I tend to encourage people to, and I prefer clover personally, just to avoid any potential hazardous side effects. So clover, alfalfa are done that way. Peas are another really good one. You can eat them whole as kind of a starchy snack, green peas especially, or you can grow them as shoots in about 10 days, and they're just like a fresh garden pea. If you've ever been around a pea, a growing pea plant, take one of the tendrils off and wow, it's really good, really tasty. In some parts of Asia, they cultivate snow peas for the shoots. So we're very kind of like, oh, a pea means a seed, but there's a lot we can do with legume sprouts. Vegetables. So the most common, like I said, was the Brassicaceae family, cruciferous vegetables, kale, kohlrabi, collards, cabbage, something without a C, I'm sure, mustard greens, all the Asian greens. Those are all in that family. They all have a similar structure. Cotyledons would be the name of the first leaves. They all have that same typical heart-shaped leaf. You can also do garlic. I know people do, or onions. They take a long time. I haven't personally done that. Beets. There's kind of a chic thing to do microgreens, little baby beets. I don't personally do that. I stick to the kind of ones that I don't have growing in my garden. But they can all be sprouted. You can easily harvest, leave one plant in your garden or someone else's garden. Wild mustard, for instance, you can go harvest those seeds and sprout those. You can either do those hydroponically, or you could do those in a tray as well. Lastly, I'll touch on grains and pseudograins. So again, going back to that opening of the seed, when that seed sprouts, it has the cotyledon, the young leaf. Now, the evolution is the cotyledon and then a true leaf, which is indicative of the species, and then it keeps going, true leaves, et cetera, will flower, fruit, depending on the species. But significantly, we think of a grain and we think of grasses. So when you think of a grain sprouting, there's one blade of grass. That's a monocot, one cotyledon. That's a simple classification. Most of them have gluten, not all, but that helps define that. Barley, wheat, rye, spelt, triticale, rice, corn, those are all grains that are grasses. And then a very similar use, but botanically different, would be pseudograins. And that just means they have dicot, which means when they emerge, the cotyledons, there's two cotyledons. So amaranth, quinoa, teff, buckwheat. Quinoa and buckwheat are my favorite out of those. Teff tend to be very, very small, and so do amaranth, although they are quite good sprouted. I find quinoa to be a good way. Just as a note, quinoa also has phytic acid, surprise, surprise, but about 95% reduction can be achieved through soaking and or fermenting. So fermenting is a wonderful topic. I could go into a lot, but for this purposes, we have to understand that that can be paired with sprouting, and in fact, very favorably in many cases, to increase nutrition and diversity. So that's an overview of what those sprouts are. So let's get down to it, how to sprout. Now, some of you have mentioned you have sprouted. That's awesome. Some of you have mentioned you are sprouting. Even better. There are many ways to do it. For years, I have done it out of a backpack, like I mentioned, or when I was bike touring, I actually had a model like this instead of a water bottle. And I would just fill up and rinse and keep me going. I was exercising, 8 to 10 or 12 hours a day on the road all the time, and it was really great to have fresh growing food. So there's 2 basic methods I could introduce: hydroponically, which simply means with water, and tray growing with a medium. And all that means is that you're growing it in something or on something. So we'll start by going through the hydroponic method. And that is very simple and very accessible. She mentioned some bags or jars that were over there. This is one of the first ones I ever had, actually. It's simply just a slotted lid that fits on wide-mouth mason jars. And there's certain models. This one happens to be high-density plastic, which is food-grade safe, supposedly. I wouldn't microwave it or anything. But there are metal options as well. The main thing what it does is it's accessible to most of us to have a mason jar. The downside of this method is that you have to have somewhere to prop it up. You kind of soak it like this in a bowl and you let that drain. So that's one downside. The second downside is airflow. So with sprouts, the main thing we need to understand is that water is very important, obviously. Temperature is very important. Airflow is also very important. So is light. So with this method, the upside is that it's very accessible, very reasonable. You can put cheesecloth, you can put anything that stops the seeds but allows water to pass. But the airflow is not great, and it takes up a little more space. Another option would be this, or a model similar to this. Now, I haven't used this in years. It has, I think, 3-day-old clover, and it works on a simple principle of the water drains and gravity rinses them. That's another great method. My personal preference is this is called an easy sprout, and I've used them for probably 12 years now. I've gone through several of them. They've gotten beat up or broke or lost. But what it is a man named Gene Monson. He does business old school. I ordered some from him, and if anyone wants any, I have some for sale. And he says, "Oh, I'll just send them to you and send me a check in the mail when you get them." I say, "How cool is that?" He does things, trustworthy, and he patented this device. But what it is this is solid, and these are food grade, dishwasher safe. So this one's a solid tray, solid tub. And this one has slots on the bottom of it, and it has ridges. It has an insert for small seeds. And how this one works is the seeds go in and you soak them. So that's the first step. Soak the seeds. That's waking the seeds up, giving them moisture, sending the message that, okay, guys, it's time to grow. Next step will be draining and rinsing. So for this model, you simply take that out and then you set it like this, which allows airflow to come in. So the cold air comes in, and the hot air generated by the living sprouts actually is forced up. And so it's a very nifty and useful thing. Air goes in, air goes out. I like this one a lot because I've had a lot better success with these models. Again, the most things you're going to have troubles with are either you're not using fresh enough seeds. So if the seeds aren't actually living, they're rotting, and that can cause mold issues. Salmonella there was a recall several years ago about sprouts and salmonella. I would not worry about that if you're doing your own hygiene. The most common thing I find for hygiene is simple hydrogen peroxide, drugstore strength, 3%. I put a spray bottle on it. Before I use any sprouts, I'll wash with hot soapy water. I'll spray everything down. And then I'll actually sometimes spray the seeds. We never know where the seeds come from, and it doesn't hurt the seeds, and you'll hear a little buzz to hear it. You know it's working. So other than that, you don't need to be worried about...
Is that pure peroxide, or did you mix it?
Well, it's actually 3%, so it's not pure. It's Nope.
It's just
Regular drugstore strength. Yeah. If you wanted to get 30% and get crazy with it, you could dilute it yourself. But that's easy. It's not going to hurt your skin. It's food safe.
I spray, when I'm doing my seed starting, I spray even the potting soil with hydrogen peroxide from the store, and you'd be amazed what bubbles up even in bag potting soil.
Yep.
Is that right? And it eliminates damping off that way.
That is a great little tip. We've had some issues with that, and I didn't even think of doing that. That's great. So hydrogen peroxide is a really good friend. It's very inexpensive, and you don't have to use a lot, especially if you use a spray bottle. Coats the sides, coats everything. So what's next? You have the seeds, you sprout them, you soak them, you drain them. Next is rinsing, and all you're doing essentially is washing it off. If it smells weird, you're not doing enough rinsing, or the seeds aren't fresh enough. So it shouldn't smell funky. And I've had some ones that are like, Either I forgot to rinse it, or you will know, and it won't smell good, especially with broccoli or high sulfur seeds. So please avoid that, or have that experience for yourself and learn why to rinse it more. So rinsing it once to twice. If it's very hot, you could do 3 times a day. And the next step, for some seeds it's optional, and some seeds it's undesirable. So the 2 I'll mention would be corn and peas. Now those are both grown as shoots, as microgreens, and those should be kept in the dark. Pardon me. There's a third, mung beans. They should often, if you want those nice big plump juicy, grow them in the dark under pressure. That's a little bit different than everything else, but mung beans, corn, and peas can all be grown in the dark, 100%. It's called blanching. And what that does is it excludes chlorophyll, and it helps bring out that sweetness. The chef I was selling to when we were living in New Mexico actually preferred them, which was fine. I was growing them indoors, so I didn't have to put lights up. It makes them a little more tender as well. But if you want that benefits of the chlorophyll, if you want that oxygenation and detox and cleansing from the inside out, deodorizing even, in World War II they actually used wheatgrass as a wound dressing. And obviously before that as well, because of its wound healing, antiseptic, cleansing properties. If you want that chlorophyll, it's very simple. It can either be a light, not as effective as true sunlight. It can be a full spectrum LED or full spectrum fluorescence. But after a few days, and after which we can come look at the sprouts and get a clearer idea, when the cotyledons open up and when the seeds start shedding, you can do 2 things here. You can rinse them and kind of let the seeds float to the surface and scoop them off. That's a personal preference. They will last longer in the fridge. They never do with me because I'm just but once there's seeds, once the cotyledons come out, exposing them to light was called greening up. And you'll see very quickly they'll turn, or they should turn, green like this. If they haven't turned a dark green like this, they're either not getting enough, or they're not getting the right quality. Plants have a certain spectrum of lighting, and if you give them a standard incandescent or LED or standard fluorescent, it's not going to give them the range of lighting they need to produce those beneficial chlorophyll, that beneficial chlorophyll. So that's kind of the last step of the hydroponics. Soak the seed, drain and rinse several times. During this whole process, on the counter by the sink is a very easy way to do it. It takes maybe 2-3 minutes a day, especially if during your routine you have your sprouter or sprouters. I've had 3 to 5 or more going at any one time because you want different varieties and you want cycles. So if you have one batch that's ready tomorrow, you want to have one that's already started that's going to be ready in a day or 2, so you can keep you and your family in sprouts. Yes?
Are you rinsing them every day?
Yes.
More than once?
Usually twice a day, so morning and night.
Okay.
And it doesn't need to take a long time. And again, you should focus on high quality water. Now, high quality as best as you can. Non-chlorinated is the #1 thing, because chlorine obviously is good for public sanitation in that it kills bacteria, but we don't want to kill our seeds, and we want to have that life force. So that's kind of the basics of, yes?
I usually put a little bit of ascorbic acid in my water, just a touch,
Mm-hmm.
after they have sprouted, and it seems to keep them fresh.
Oh, that's
Really,
great.
Really, really nice.
That's a good tip. I've never heard of that. Ascorbic acid?
Yeah, same thing. I just ever so tiny
Uh-huh.
bit, and it really makes them keep it.
Great piece of advice. Thank you. I'll have to try that out. So are there any questions on that basics on hydroponic sprouts before we get into microgreens? Great. So microgreens are, it's basically a classification. After sprouts, you could say the sprouts have cotyledons, so they've come out. Microgreens are the next stage when they start having their true leaves. If you think about the progression, then there's baby greens. I brought some of those today. I was thinning the garden. Didn't have any microgreens because I've been on vacation, but I do have some baby greens, which is the next stage when you have 2 or maybe 4 true leaves, which then gets into full-size greens, mature greens, like a head of lettuce. So you think about what stages, and the basics of tray sprouting, you can do it in an old fruit tray. You can do it in a clamshell from berries or other things, or takeout containers. Really anything. The main things you need to consider are, is it going to have good airflow? Is it going to have good drainage? And can it hold water? If you answer those questions, do whatever you want. I tend to use these 10-20 trays. If anyone's a gardener, You've seen them, used them. They're 10 inches by 20 inches, so it's very easy to remember. And I'll lift up one of these to show you all. I tend to use the solid trays if I can, and I have them. The 4X are best, which is 4 strength. They just last longer. They're thicker. The bottom tray is a reservoir, and the top tray, soil everywhere. The top tray has slots like this, and what that will allow to do is it'll act as a capillary. It'll act, once the sprouts or the microgreens have taken hold, they'll actually wick the water up. So fairly simple equipment, obviously can be reused again and again. Yes?
Where are you getting that gray tray?
I got these in Taos, where we lived in New Mexico. I don't know what suppliers are around here. It was a hydroponic store, so any growers, I know that there's a lot of mega greenhouse or something. I've ordered things from them online, but I don't have a good source. I'm sorry. So,
Dollar Tree has square cupcake carriers. It's got the lid and the little cupcake things, and I just punched holes in the bottom and used the top for the solid.
yeah, that's great. Get creative. Find a way to make it work. You could.
get both of those at farm stores too.
Great. Great.
Okay, great.
So however it works out, you could also do this outdoors in the garden. We plant Austrian peas as a cover crop, but we also eat them as a microgreen. So it's kind of a good double benefit. So in doing this, you could either do this for animals, for fodder. You could do this for cats. I know wheatgrass was a big thing for cats or dogs, but significantly, it's very easy and it's very quick. It's kind of a little more like gardening than sprouting, but the basics are, I use coir, and some people really enjoy vermiculite or perlite, other neutral water-absorbing things. Coir tends to be a good choice for me. It's a neutral, and it's not like peat moss. It doesn't have the ecological implications.
I can't find that in town either. Where are you getting that?
I ordered that online, actually.
I've got a worm supplier that sells it, but it's so expensive, those bricks.
If you get the bricks, I think it's about, I don't want to give you a price. It's a little bit more expensive than peat if you're comparing them, but it doesn't have the implications and it's not acidic. I'm not too familiar with distributors around here, but
It's hard to get. I even asked if Carl Wayne's did special order at farming, and they said no, we tried.
we definitely need more gardening stores then.
Yeah, more organic gardening. Now,
Yeah.
Carl Wayne has a nice aisle of organics, but they said their supplier couldn't get
Huh.
them before.
They should be. So that's unfortunate, but
Yeah.
10 of the plant growing trays are $21, Amazon Prime.
great.
Ah.
There we go. That's one way to do it. So once you have your trays, whether you make them, whether you grow them in a garden, whether you find them, salvage them, big bore or steal them, doesn't matter. You don't need a lot of medium. And some people say you need compost or bioactive compost. These seeds are going to be in that medium for at most 2 weeks. So for me, in all the different layers I have going and the preciousness of our vermicompost, I tend to use straight coir, sometimes add a bit of kelp, maybe a worm tea, but I basically just creating a medium for the roots. Yes?
How do you spell that?
C-O-I-R.
Just like that.
It's pronounced coir, C-O-Y-E-R, and it's just cocoa husk. It's a byproduct. Versus peat, which is mined, and it has severe implications, and it's also acidic. So, yep. So I use that. It's about 1 inch thick. It's not very much soil.
That's also what mine is. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Those beginning baskets, that's for that.
So you could use that. You could use potting soil, topsoil, compost, whatever. The basics of it is you want a nice, solid medium, and what it's going to do. Yep. Is it essentially is creating a surface for moisture. That's the main thing. It's giving the roots a place to take hold. It's orienting them. If you notice in a sprouting container, sprouts will be growing every which way, but then they'll right themselves. So they'll be growing upright. This gives you space to spread things out, and it's a little different in that they will be grown and then cut and harvested. So you could do this with peas and sunflowers or buckwheat, though there is some studies that show that excessive uses of buckwheat causes some weird thing called phagopyrism, which makes you really sensitive to light. People who are doing like 3 trays of this a day, green juice fast. So don't go overboard, but buckwheat's fine. Peas are my favorite because you don't have to On a sunflower, sometimes you'll have to take the shell off and it's a little tedious, but they're very delicious, very high protein, very easy to grow. For that, you would soak the seeds. You'd soak 2 cups and then drain them and then plant them right away. Now, today we're going to do curled cress, and this is a bit of an exception because it is mucilaginous, so it doesn't sprout well. And I happen to have a lot of these seeds that I haven't planted in the garden. And they're really tasty and zingy like watercress. So for a 10-20 tray, it'll be about 3 tablespoons of seeds. If you're doing peas and sunflowers, again, that's about 2 cups. So for the larger seeds, you soak to help germination, and you want to create an even mat. That's what we're going for. Mm-hmm.
Is that in your book?
Yes, all of these details and more, and as well as about 30 or 40 recipes, are all in this book. So it's very quick, I know, but the basics of it is that with a moist medium, I'm going to take 3 tablespoons. Make sure it's somewhat flat. It's not as important, but one simple way to do that is just to take another tray and gently press that down. And that should give you a fairly flat surface. Now what I'm going to do here is take a tablespoon, spread it evenly about on a third. Do that 3 times so we have 3 tablespoons evenly spread. And this is just going to be watered in nicely after that, and it's going to sprout up cress. And if you've ever had watercress, you know how delicious it is. And again, I'm just going for good density. It takes a little bit of practice, and I'm not always perfect at it, but just be gentle and keep trying. If you have any missing spots, feel free to use a little more. But the basics of it is that once you've seeded it, and you've watered it, the next steps will be to keep it contained for about 2 or 3 days while the germination happens. Now with peas and sunflowers, the best is a weight because that'll actually create strength and it'll make them juicier. And it'll like a baby, when they struggle out, they get stronger. Same thing with these, not so with the small seeds like broccoli or cabbage. So the cress is an example where I wouldn't press on it because they're not big enough to press the tray up. So I'll invert this and keep that in the dark for a few days. There's no need for light. It'll just help. Actually, it won't help because it'll help evaporate water. So after a couple days, keep watered, exposed to light. And for microgreens, when they're a few inches high, or for peas and sunflowers, when they're about 4 to 6 inches high, harvest them with scissors slightly above the medium and eat them. You can rinse them if you're concerned about any pathogens or any debris. And they last several days in the fridge. I tend to harvest them as I go and eat them, juice them, blend them, whatever floats your boat. So that's a little bit about microgreens. The last thing we're going to get into is different ways to use sprouts. And we've talked a little bit about, obviously, sprouting vegetables. Of course, sprouted seeds can be used, like vegetable seeds, can be used in salads and soups and sandwiches and main dishes and smoothies and all the above. But where it gets kind of fun is realizing, okay, can I make a sprouted food? Can I make this meal with sprouted food? So we think about bread, very common example. Sprouted bread takes a little more finesse, takes a little more equipment, and there are now brands on the market that use sprouted bread. Now that doesn't mean that if you cook sprouted food, it's bad. It just means it's certainly a lot better than non-sprouted food, especially something like bread. So that's a good example. You can make breads out of it. Mentioning earlier about nuts and seeds, you can make nut milks, smoothies. You can ferment them. I have recipes for fermented yogurts and pressed cheeses as well. It's a non-dairy alternative, very rich in proteins and fats. You can obviously do stews. You can do casseroles. You can do smoothies, like I said. Basically, anything you eat. If you think, okay, is there anything in this that could be sprouted? All winter long, we ate a lot of, one of our main staples was some tomatoes we had canned up, some deer we had hunted, and some quinoa. And we ate that a lot. But that quinoa was several days sprouted. Just a winter food that just give yourself a little boost, get rid of that, that phytic acid. That's a significant one for nuts and seeds and beans. And of course, the sky's the limit. Sprouted foods, sprouted salads is a great one. With peas, they make a really delicious either addition or the base of the salad. Great for salad dressings, some of those seeds, pâtés, which we can try tonight. And hopefully, this has given you enough to work with to go home and sprout and try some of those out on your own. If there's any questions, feel free to ask. But other than that, I am done my presentation. So thank you all for listening.
Question, what's a way that anybody watching this video can reach out to you, either by whatever you'd like to share, email, phone, website, anything like that?
Okay, so the best way would be social media. We're on a social media platform called Steemit.
Called what?
Social media platform. It's called Steemit. S-T-E-E-M-I-T. And our moniker handle is Mountain Jewel, which is also the name of our farm, so @MountainJewel. And we post blogs about homesteading and permaculture and natural building and herbalism and all the other things somewhat sprouting related we're working to. And that's the main way to get in touch with me. I can give also my email if anyone wants to contact me. I'll spell it out. IANGIESBRECHT. B as in Bob, RECHT, and that's at Gmail. Happy to answer any questions, especially if you get down and you're, oh yeah, what was that thing? Or, you know, how did I do that? Or, hey, what about now? Or I have this issue. Or however, I'm happy to hear, happy to spread the sprouting love, and always happy to hear of
Where can we get your book?
You can get it right here. Yeah, you can also contact me by email. I can send them directly, or if you want to go through, there's on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or anywhere good books are sold. But if you buy it from me, I'll really appreciate it because I get most of the money rather than this much. So always grateful for that, yeah.
What's the name of your book?
Oh, name of my book. It's, funnily enough, called Sprouts, Live Well with Living Food. And I had this published, I think 2 years ago by now, by a small independent book publisher called Microcosm, and they do a lot of DIY kind of radical things, and so they put all the graphics together. I wrote it, and here it is. Any other questions? Yes.
I want to know about sprouting oats. There's a lot of debate on how to properly sprout oats.
So the first thing I'll say is hull-less oats, as in they don't have a hull when they're grown, are probably going to be your best bet. I've tried sprouting oats with a hull, and then they just get caught in your teeth, and they're very hard to digest. So I would get hull-less oats, and not all of those hull-less oats will sprout. So I've had some not so great examples, or experiences, pardon me. You can grow oat grass, but if you're talking like sprouting oat groats to eat as a porridge, I would...
Just to offset phytic acid. Right?
Yeah. So to offset the phytic acid, I will actually even do that with flaked oats. I'll ferment them for 3 to 5 days. A touch of yogurt if you want to help the fermentation. But for oat groats, you could soak 8 to 12 hours and then sprout 2 days. And that phytic acid will be leached out. Oatmeal is another one. There's studies showing how damaging it is for your mouth, your minerals, and how many cavities it causes. So if I like that soft oats, the flaked oats, fermenting does a really good job of also neutralizing that phytic acid. Any other questions?
When are you coming back to talk about fermenting?
That's a great question. When things are in season, when we have whenever I can, I would love to, because we ferment a lot of things, and it's a little bit more varied than sprouting, because you're kind of like, well, I have this thing coming up, or I just foraged this one plant, or this flower is in bloom, or whatever. So hopefully this spring or summer. I don't know.
Tell us your name.
I go by Eni. My legal or book name would be Ian, but I go by Eni. Everyone knows me by Eni, I-N-I. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed yourselves.